use he, him pronouns. I will be the host for today. I am the day-to-day drug checking program manager with Addictions, Drug, and Alcohol Institute. And today we are just going to be taking a dive into drug checking and drug checking in the state of Washington. So, yeah, go ahead and get started here. All right, so just quick little Zoom webinar logistics. So as audience members, you will not be able to share your audio and video. If you do have comments or questions, go ahead and just put them into the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the webinar when we have a little time set aside for a Q&A section. On that regard, please be respectful and be kind with those comments and questions. And yeah, this webinar will be recorded and is being recorded and will be posted with the slides, so you all can access it later. Real quick, the agenda for today. So we're just going to do a quick little broad overview about what is drug checking, what is the Community Drug Checking Network, or the CDCN, here in the state of Washington. We'll have a quick little video that is just a broad overview of the drug checking process. And then we will have a curated panel discussion with two lovely technicians who offer drug checking services in the state of Washington. And then we will do a guided tour of our new drug checking webpage and data dashboard. And then it'll be the Q&A and the resource section at the end of the webinar. All right. So what is drug checking? So the primary goal of drug checking is to assist people who use drugs in making more informed decisions about their drug use in order to sort of help reduce the risks of overdose and other negative health outcomes. Secondary goals are to work with community stakeholders, help provide more accurate and up-to-date information about the local drug supply, so it can open doors for greater collaboration within the community to provide more wraparound care for folks who use drugs. So when we're talking about drug checking, there's two sort of main models that are noted when people are talking about drug checking. There's the self-test method, which has been around for a little while. It primarily started with reagent testing. So it was using different chemicals, and it would create reactions, and based on color changes, that would sort of give you an idea of the substance or the sample that you were checking. And in more recent years, they've adopted immunoassay test strips. You probably heard about fentanyl test strips, xylazine test strips, benzodiazepine test strips. These are test strips that were designed for UAs, but were sort of adopted by the harm reduction community in order to sort of meet a need, which was checking samples for fentanyl and these various substances. And then the second model of drug checking is a more point of care testing model. So typically this is where trained staff use a combination of various drug checking technologies. These can and often are immunoassay test strips, reagent testing, and then sometimes more advanced technologies like FTIR and lab grade equipment to get a better image of what that sample contains. Usually this model looks like participants provide samples at these various sites. So these could be SSPs, this could be music festivals, dance clubs. Samples are brought in, and then these staff members sort of assist in the drug checking process. These can also be mail-in sample models, drop-off sample models, or sit-down participant engagement models. So when we're talking about community drug checking or the point of care drug checking in the state of Washington, we have the Washington State Community Drug Checking Network, or the CDCN. This is the partnership of organizations around Washington State that provide community level drug checking and other related harm reduction services. The role of ADAI in all this is to help provide technical assistance, training, operational day-to-day support for the network, and work in collaboration with Public Health in Seattle-King County. So the Washington CDCN currently consists of 7 full model sites. Full model referring to sites that have an FTIR machine and use test strips. Fentanyl, xylazine, benzodiazepine, the combination of those 2 tools for drug checking, and then samples are often sent to a lab for the secondary testing. 5 light sites are in the phase of onboarding, and the difference here is that these sites don't have an FTIR machine, so they're utilizing those test strips, the same test strips, and then also sending samples out for secondary testing or checking. Some of the early outcomes, just very broad numbers, since the CDCN has been offering drug checking services, there's been 547 unique participants served and 991 samples that have been checked. And I think these numbers were pulled from February of this year. So real quick, we'll just jump into this little video. I'm going to sort of live narrate as the video plays. I'll do my best to keep up with it. So this is a full model site. As you can see, the FTIR there. This is the typical setup where you'll have the laptop, the FTIR machine, and then a sterile surface and tools. This is a technician who is very carefully loading a sample onto the FTIR for checking, lowering the anvil that allows the infrared light to go through the sample, and the light absorption brings up this spectrum with peaks and troughs. There is a special software that technicians use and a various set of reference libraries, so you can use them to sort of match those spectrums to what the sample has provided. Pictured there was a test strip. The important part here is dilution, so it's very carefully measuring amounts of water to sample ratio, dissolving that sample really well to sort of get the best image of that sample's makeup, and then running that test strip. Each test strip has a unique set of water to drug ratio depending on the drug you're testing and the test strip you're using. The last frame was a lovely whiteboard. It hangs out in the lobby for participants to be able to see recent results. So now we can just sort of jump into our panel discussion for today. I'm going to go ahead and let our panel guests introduce themselves. Georgia, would you mind going first?
Hi, my name is Georgia, pronouns she, they, and I work for Public Health Seattle-King County, and I do drug checking at the Downtown Needle Exchange there.
Malia.
And I'm Malia Lewis. I work with Blue Mountain Heart to Heart in Southeastern Washington and do drug checking in our SSP locations.
Yeah. All right, so we'll just jump on into it. All right, so this first question is sort of about how each drug checking site has kind of various processes regarding sample collection, relaying results, participant engagement, what that looks like for your site, even geographical locations and internal site setups for drug checking. Would you each mind sharing a bit about your own setup and the process that you have sort of set in place for communicating results to participants?
So for me, I don't do any mobile services. It is just I work out of the Downtown Needle Exchange, which is a part of the public health building in downtown Seattle. I try and adjust what it looks like for each person based on how they want the process to go. So for some people, they want to give me a sample in our lobby and then come back at the end of the day for the results. Some people want to give me their sample sitting with me behind the counter and then sit with me as I process the sample and give them their results real time. And so it's typically obtaining the sample, asking persons questions about the sample, their experience using it, what it was sold as, and those things can help me when I'm reading the spectra and trying to identify things that could match up with their experience. And then running test strips, packaging them for secondary testing, and then delivering results to someone. And I only give people results in person, or with some people who come in frequently and give me large numbers of samples, I can have an envelope waiting behind the counter with like a code name on it for them to receive. So I try to make it as accessible as possible for people. And then as far as like engagement, it's typically just advertised towards existing needle exchange clients. But then those clients have gone on to refer other people, whether it's people they supply drugs to, their friends, to come in and also get services. And so we definitely try to emphasize advertising the services to people who are getting fentanyl test strips, or bring up any kind of questions or concerns about things in their drugs. And then things like signs or infographics with our current up-to-date test results to kind of intrigue people into the service.
We have a pretty similarly tailored setup where it looks pretty different depending on who I'm serving, right? And what their needs look like. It's dependent on what their comfort level is with identifying that they have substances on their person. Lots of folks who have been heavily impacted by adjudication are really unlikely to want to pull their drugs out in the SSP, even if they are encouraged to do so. So it's working around people's comfort level. It's working around people's comfort level with me and what rapport we've built. I'm also only advertising to current syringe service program participants, but word of mouth travels pretty quickly, especially where I live. And we've had folks come in, a couple of folks have come in who are not currently using the SSP to use this service. I will give results typically directly and immediately if folks are going to sit down with me and go through the process. If they are too uncomfortable to do that, I can provide that information later in the day, or via text or phone call. Although I'm very careful with what I share via text or phone call, because maintaining people's safety and not ruining that rapport is really important to me. I also have a results board that is completely anonymous. So it has the date, what the sample was sold as, what I saw in the FTIR test strip results, and lab results when they come in eventually. If I've gotten approval to send it to the lab from the participant. So that information is available for folks all the time and has been a really great way to sort of drum up interest. It's right next to the water cooler in our SSP, so folks spend a lot of time in that corner anyway. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, since you both have been offering drug checking services for a little while now, what do you think some of the biggest benefits to participants? Yeah, let's just start there. What do you think the biggest benefits for drug checking, providing drug checking services to that participant would be?
You want to go first, Malia?
Sure. I think informed consent is important in all areas, right? And we're getting closer and closer to informed consent when we're able to identify what's in the substance that folks are using. It gives them information about whether or not they want to use that substance. It gives them information about how to dose it appropriately. It gives them information about trust with the folks who provided them that substance. It also gives information on sort of what the clinical impacts of some of the cuts and buffs in the supply might be. And that's something that folks, like, we spend a lot of time societally discussing the impacts of drugs, but we don't always talk about what else is in that and how it might impact our bodies. So we've been talking about liver health a lot because of the Tylenol in the M30s that we're seeing, and those kinds of things are really useful. It also, because we are co-located with clinical services, it gives us an opportunity to help inform. If I have consent from the participant, let me be very clear, but if I have consent from the participant and they know or they want me to share some information with clinical staff that might help inform the way that wound care is done, or the way that what meds might be safer based on interactions, those kinds of things, we're going to share that information and sort of optimize people's outcomes as much as possible.
Yeah, I think giving that person autonomy to make their own decisions and have those be informed decisions is super huge. I think for a lot of people, this can be like the only form of medical care that they might be interested in engaging in, or it's the only place where they can openly talk about drug use in a somewhat like clinical sense, bringing up concerns about when I take this benzo, it does this to me, or I'm acting this way, that they might not feel comfortable sharing anywhere else, or that there isn't a place to talk about that. So I think in addition to what Malia said about, having, you get to make decisions for your health based off of learning more about what's in your substance, also having a person where you get to engage in those conversations with them. We definitely keep our SSP very like anonymous, and you get to control how you want the interaction to go. So if you just want to come in and get your supplies and leave, not say a single word, you can totally do that. But this has given some people who maybe were not going to be in that position where they want to sit and chat about their life story, they have like a safe space to open up and tell you more things. So that has been something I've really noticed that I didn't expect coming into it.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I guess you kind of alluded to it a little bit here, Malia, with the wraparound healthcare. Is what sort of benefits have you seen as things have progressed at sort of more of a community level, as far as like participants and their sort of direct friends or acquaintances in that individual's community?
What have I seen? How has it impacted the community? It's definitely like improved some conversation about like if I'm talking about a substance, I don't know what's actually in it, and I'm identifying all of these weird experiences, there's not a lot of, you can't really move through that conversation in a productive way, right? You're just stuck at an impasse with this mystery. And being able to identify, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of cut in that, and this is the potential impact of that, or I don't actually know what that is, but I haven't seen it in that before. And like, maybe we should talk collectively about how that's used, or how you can take care of your friends as they're using it, or like what strategies are going to be useful beyond the go slow, never use alone kind of basics, right? These are the things to potentially watch out for. This is, if you see a wound that looks like this, I'm not saying that this is what's in your drugs, but I am saying if you could come see the wound care nurse, I would really appreciate it, because I want to make sure that you're okay. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about how people who use drugs look out for each other so much and share information throughout the community. And so when we get a chance to have a good educational moment with someone about like what is the real threat of xylazine, or what is actually happening, and correcting misinformation, or providing them more specific harm reduction information beyond generic things you would throw out, that has the ability to impact not just one person, but their group of friends, the people they use with, as well as being able to check drugs for people who sell drugs. You get to impact the supply chain at a different level that can have pretty big effects. And then I think also in general, being connected within these networks has been something that ultimately benefits the people we serve. So we're connected with, there's 2 other sites in Seattle I work with. And so I'm connected with them every week. I connect with Washington State every week. I connect with people on the West Coast, people in the whole country. And so I think learning more about drug trends around the country, around the world, around our state, learning from Malia about how their drug supply is different than mine is something that gives me really valuable information to share with clients.
I would absolutely agree with that. It's so valuable to see sort of what's happening outside of us and how our microcosm may be reflecting or not reflecting that. I also think that we get this really unique opportunity to both share information with clients. Like, I know that you think that there's an association with this color and this particular component in the substances, but let me whip out my phone and show you some of the different purples that I have seen this week and what we were able to see in them, and have that difference. But also I've gotten so much opportunity to learn from participants about things that are fully within their expertise that I would not have any other way to learn. And so it's an incredibly valuable moment.
Wow, it's very beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, and the whole network piece, I think I kind of like skipped in the forefront too. It's like this drug checking is much bigger than just like us in Washington State, and it's this sort of like very impressive like collaboration of people from all over the world and helping each other try to like figure out these processes and best practices, all with keeping in heart and mind like best serving people who use drugs and who are accessing the services and leaning on each other for support. So huge. Thank you. All right. Are people often surprised by what you find while checking drugs? And do participants notice or note any potential changes in behaviors based on these findings?
I'd say it's like 50. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I think it's like 50-50, honestly. Some folks are like, yeah, I knew that. Cool. Thanks for the confirmation. And they're out, especially with samples that are a little bit simpler. Sometimes folks are like, no, there's absolutely something else in there and you're just not seeing it. And I'm like, yeah, I hear you. And this is imperfect technology. And I've only been doing it for, about a year. So there are all sorts of things that I could potentially be missing. There are also just different aspects of set and setting that we get an opportunity to discuss with folks when they're surprised by the lack of adulterants potentially. And there have also been just some oddball samples that have weird kitchen sink stuff in it. And folks are surprised and we're able to have like pretty in-depth engaged discussions about that. And occasionally folks are really surprised that their sample is so clean. So, it's
I
It's a
would say
mix.
I feel like most of the time people are surprised by the lack of things that are in their drugs. And I think most of the time the active ingredient is what someone expects it to be. More frequently as people that don't have knowledge about cuts that are in their drugs, which is interesting, and people's knowledge varies so widely about the things that they're using. So explaining to acetaminophen what that is, or explaining what mannitol is, and that's something that is expected in their drugs, but they just didn't know to expect that in their drugs. I would say people are surprised about sometimes the content of fentanyl, like the amount of it. They do expect it to be fentanyl, but sometimes the relative amount of it can be surprising to someone, and it's something we're learning about our own state by doing this and trying to get better answers about it. There are certain things that can be like little mix up things, like people thinking that they're buying brand name Xanax when it's a different benzo that has, some similar effects, but also has a different potency, and you need to use that differently. Or people buying MDMA and it turns out to be MDA. Also, I've had samples where people are trying to pass something off as fentanyl, but it's plaster. And so that carries its own health implications if someone decides to inject that. And you would definitely want to know what that is before injecting it. And so there's potential harms that aren't just overdose related.
And there are occasionally people, sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
Oh, there are just occasionally people who are like both surprised and absolutely not going to believe me no matter what I say. And that's okay too. Like, I'm here to reflect the information that I'm able to provide, and like people can do with that what they will.
Yeah, I think sometimes just letting someone know what is in their drugs doesn't give them an answer to the questions they have. Like around meth, typically people having it make them feel sleepy. And so then you have to kind of redirect conversations to like, well, let's talk about sleep schedules and hygiene and these other harm reduction related things. And I can't give you the answer that you want to hear, that there's some secret benzo hiding in here. So that can be a more difficult conversation to have with people, is when you aren't finding unexpected substances.
Yeah, and I think like the kind of the underlining thing is really just like taking the time to be engaged and willing to have those conversations and hear people out and figure out like what that question is that they're trying to get answered, and ways that you can answer that question, even if you sort of have a non-answer to that question, so to speak. So
yeah, when I'm checking someone's drugs, something I try to make an effort to do is like, what question can I answer for you? Like, what specifically are you trying to find out? Like, some people really want to know if there's fentanyl in their meth. And then that way I can also give them detailed instructions on how to check it themselves. Or a lot of people don't know how to use properly use fentanyl test strips, especially with meth. So getting to have little educational moments is important.
We had a really in-depth conversation with somebody who came in who was very certain that there was fentanyl in their meth and that they needed Suboxone treatment on the basis of not being able to quit the meth because of the fentanyl. And so we were able to sit down, test the bag that the person had in their pocket, get a UA for them so that they could engage in the contingency management program for reducing meth use because they'd expressed an interest in that. As we got the results from the drug check and the UA, we were able to demonstrate that there wasn't any fentanyl present at that time. And so like it was easier to make more appropriate clinical referrals, those kinds of things on that basis, and not be pushing somebody toward a treatment that they didn't actually need, and offer some relief because this person was really concerned and really didn't want any fentanyl in their supply at all. So
and was the second part of the question like, how would people use the information they get?
yeah,
Okay.
it's like potential changes in behavior based on findings. Has anyone ever vocalized that to either of you?
Yeah. So I would say most of the time, I don't know what people do with their drugs once they leave, if they want to use it or not. I would say I have seen people have shared with me like they are going to cut it themselves to make it a lower dose for themselves. People have told me that they're going to start with a lower dose or try a different method, like smoking it first before trying to inject it. I had one person who came in and was like a party kid getting his MDMA checked for a festival. And even with just a false positive on a fentanyl test strip, he threw out the whole bag and said, like, I don't even want to risk it. And he had the financial means to get another batch of whatever he wanted. I've also had people who sell drugs decide that they were not going to sell the thing that they got tested because it wasn't as they expected, and they really care about the people that they serve and wanted to make sure they had good experiences. People talk about like changing their supplier when they are getting something and they don't like what they're getting from them, or when they're, their current supplier is out and they need to switch to a new supplier. They don't feel safe with that, so they want to get it checked before because they, only do tar heroin and they don't want to even risk that it's anything else. And I've also had people who use that conversation and drug checking as an opportunity to open up about how they feel about their use and being unhappy with their current levels of use or wanting to make some kind of behavior change about drugs in general. And so I'm also able to give resources, like we have a social worker there. I'm able to let people talk to, or we have a Suboxone clinic on the 4th floor of our building, or a methadone van right outside, or we have a really, really amazing medical clinic for any drug user health concerns. So I think all those services located together makes those conversations really productive.
I think Georgia covered all of it.
No, that was great. I think like one piece that I would like just to touch on very quickly about that is with the MDMA and the test strip is I think it's important to note that like while drug checking in general is a big step and an awesome harm reduction tool to have, it's still new, very new. And these tools will, I think, always have limitations. Like realistically, these tools will all have limitations, and each tool has its own set of limitations. So when someone is getting their drugs checked, it's important that like it's never noted that your drug is now safe for consumption, and it's generally still purchased in an unregulated underground market, so to speak, and often those drugs aren't going to come with a list of ingredients and what's in them and manufacturing information. So I think it's just important to note, like, there's limitations and it's not guaranteed, but it's a very important tool. And as both of these technicians have spoke to, it's really important as far as like engagement goes and wraparound care for folks, and providing that autonomy in a world that people generally didn't have. So and I think there's one final question, and that is, what do you hope to see in the future of drug checking in Washington State? And then also just in the US in general, what do you hope for the future of drug checking?
Expansion of services, absolutely. We need more sites, more places, improving that access, and increase in expertise as the field grows and we have more techs coming on, and we're able to continue growing that expertise and teaching new folks. I think that's what I'm most excited about. Like Georgia talked about earlier, that sense of community and the opportunity to really dig deeply into the weird quirks of various samples is really my joy spot in this work. That's the fascinating piece that I think has the most utility to the communities that we're serving.
Yeah, I think same thing, more drug checking and everywhere and beautifully funded and have technicians that are full-time dedicated to doing that. All of us, every single person who works on the network has 50 million jobs to do when they're at their work site. And it really is a position where that person needs to be dedicated to seeing what's happening around the country, learning about new drugs that are coming up when they're getting results. It is like a very dedicated full-time thing. So I'd love to see that. I'd love to see more overdose prevention sites linked with drug checking. Of course, that comes with a big caveat. We need overdose prevention sites, but how they're able to do that in New York is super admirable and is a direct way that you can prevent overdose and negative outcomes. I would love to see drug checking in Washington State also happen at large scale events like music festivals. You can get a really large snapshot of what the drug supply is like in a short amount of time. And people who are attending those events are also likely not using for dependence reasons, and they're more likely that they will dispose of that substance if it is not what was expected. They're also likely people that are not engaged with traditional harm reduction settings a lot, and it can be one of the only ways that they might engage with learning more about substances. And yeah, just more of it everywhere, and laws that will allow us to do it everywhere.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. Yeah, so you both are incredible, and very happy and lucky to be a part of this network, and I'm excited to see how we all grow together. So appreciate you being here. And I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to pass it over to Caleb.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data, but before I do that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Caleb Banter-Green. I work at the University of Washington with Ben. And at ADAI, I direct our Center for Community Engaged Drug Education, Epidemiology, and Research. And I just want to say thank you to Malia and Georgia and Ben. This is really amazing work. I am learning so much, and this is such a neat way to learn with our community about what's going on out there. As someone who has training both in public health and social work, this is a pretty amazing manifestation of how those things can come together, and also really a neat way to see the explicit value of harm reduction services, providing valuable information and engagement with folks that you've both talked about, which I think is really exciting, and also really important about where power sits. And where power sits in the context of data around drugs. And as someone who's done drug epidemiology for 22 years, the information are interesting. They're generally useful. maybe, but they're not terribly useful in the moment for people who use substances to inform their actions. And this really turns that around, and I'm really excited about that. These are really complicated data. The most important piece is what's happening in these interactions. I'm going to show you something very different, which is sort of the summary of those data, which has a really important place. And there's some important insights there that I'll share with you. But just acknowledging these are complicated data. And the webpage I'm going to show you in just a moment is just one sort of version 1.0 sense of what some of the quantitative data look like coming out of this. There's a lot more to come. A lot more to figure out. Honestly, this is complicated, and then the drug market is continuously changing, and by definition, it is quite hidden. So I'm going to show you our webpage and get you a little bit oriented to it, and you are not there's no test. So just sort of take this as like a little sample, a little teaser of what's out there, and I really encourage people to spend some time really with this webpage and digesting this. So the webpage, you can see the URL up at the top. Maybe someone could throw it in the chat, that'd be great. I want to be really clear. These are the data for the secondary testing. So when the samples are collected at the site, many people will then have those samples, a little subsamples, sent off to a lab to get tested. These are the results from that secondary testing using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, which are extremely detailed and extremely sensitive results. So we expect to see additional information than what we see at the point of care testing. So just sharing that with you. Some of the data I'm going to share are our cumulative data across the whole project. And then some of the data are for the last 3 months. And of course, we want to show both of those. But in some ways, the last 3 months is what matters the most because the market's always changing. So just to show you in the upper right here, this first graph, this is just showing that from August through October, there were 317 samples sent for secondary testing, and I'm going to show the results for 293 of those samples in some graphs down below. So for the circular graph, those are for the last 3 months. And Ben, I'm just confirming you can see this webpage correctly. Yes, great. Okay. This is showing the most common substances that we detect across all of the samples. So the nearly 1,000 samples that have been tested since we started, these are the most common samples detected. And they're of different types, and I'll say a little bit more about where you can learn more about the structure here. But so about a third of samples have been positive for methamphetamine, about a third for fentanyl, a lot of fentanyl precursors. They're almost always present on some of these fentanyl samples, fentanyl analogs, other analgesics. I'll talk about that in a moment. That's primarily acetaminophen. You can see cocaine, ketamine, heroin, other impurities, and non-pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. I will just define that now. So if we think about things like alprazolam, and the brand names like Xanax, Ativan, those things, there are non-pharmaceutical benzodiazepines that are very commonly out there, things like atizolam and things like that I'll show you in just a moment. So this is get a really high level what we're seeing. And then I want to zoom down here a little bit and show you this and help interpret these. So this is looking over the most recent 3-month period for things that were brought in as fentanyl pills, what was in them. So there were 48 samples of things sold as fentanyl pills. 47 actually had fentanyl, so almost all. 47 also had essentially acetaminophen, and just 2 of them had xylazine. So that's fentanyl pills, and I'll show this later. We're seeing something really quite different in fentanyl powder. Again, the fentanyl powder, 46 samples, 43 are actually fentanyl. And then we're also seeing, we're seeing methamphetamine in 6 of those. We don't know how much that might be cross-contamination, either when the drug was sold, how it was packaged, how it was used. We just don't know. But that does give us some sense that there, at least in the products we're testing, there's some methamphetamine. And then lastly, just to share, we are seeing xylazine in 6 of those samples. So a somewhat larger proportion than we see in pills. For cocaine, 17 samples, 16 actually had cocaine, 3 had fentanyl, and then 1 had levamisole. So just to share with you, we are adapting these graphs based on what we are hearing from clients and staff are the important other substances of note. So levamisole is something we've seen in cocaine for over a decade, so we made sure to report that here explicitly. For methamphetamine, a lot of samples, 89 sold as methamphetamine, virtually all had methamphetamine. And then you can see 4 of them had fentanyl, and then another, I know it's in there, the MSM, which is a component in methamphetamine that we see as well. So that's just giving you a high level on our landing page. Did this switch over to the drug coding page, Ben? I just want to make sure it switched. Okay, good. You never know with Zoom what it's going to do. I'm not going to read this to you, but I do want to make sure that if you're using this webpage that you read it, please, because these are complicated data and I want you to know what we're talking about. So we do a lot of having to categorize the drugs. There are thousands and thousands of substances. So we're trying to aggregate this in a way that information is actually digestible. So this is this category that we call major drugs, helpful for you to see what's in that. This is more about xylazine. What are things that we're categorizing in minor drugs? What are some other drugs of interest? And you'll see in a moment why these categories matter. And then we're also defining some of these. So for instance, what's a phenethylamine, you might ask? Well, things like MDMA, NDA, and other products are phenethylamines. So that's getting extremely technical. I recognize that, but you're going to see that language and I want you to understand why. So a few more things here. Just going to show a few examples here. So for things sold as methamphetamine, this top graph is showing that, and the purple shading here says there was methamphetamine present. So these are different variations. Purple is saying methamphetamine is present. The red shading is saying it is not. These sub shadings are the presence of other substances as well. So that's something to digest a bit. Here for methamphetamine, you can see essentially 98% of the samples had methamphetamine and not a lot else. Generally speaking, on the West Coast, the meth is kind of meth. That's different than on the East Coast. So if you're hearing about drug trends and you see some national news, you see something from the East Coast, don't assume it's the same here. We're not seeing a lot of fentanyl in our stimulants. They generally often are more likely to see fentanyl in their stimulants. So you can see fentanyl here in 2.5% of the methamphetamine. Okay. And then I can tell that I'm going to be struggling here with Zoom. Hang on just a sec. I apologize for that getting small. That is Zoom being the wrong size. Okay, so a couple more things to share with you. These are things that were sold as M30s or fentanyl in a pill form. Typically fentanyl, but almost always for pills, this other analgesic or acetaminophen. And that actually matters because we might be seeing substantial amounts of acetaminophen, particularly when people are using dozens of pills a day. So that's something to be mindful of on the medical side. And thinking about liver impacts. We also are seeing a bit of methamphetamine, a little bit of pharmaceutical opioid, but very rarely are we seeing xylazine. So that's in the context of these M30 pills. This is looking at things, this is one more level of detail. In these M30 pills, another way to look at this is sort of the two-way combinations. So here we never are seeing fentanyl by itself, generally because we're seeing other analogs or precursors, but we often are seeing acetaminophen. We're occasionally seeing meth, we're rarely seeing xylazine. So this is for pills, and I'm not going to do it today, but if you put this side by side with what we see in powders, they look pretty different. So this is looking at powders, powdered form of fentanyl. What's super important here is it's a little less likely to be fentanyl. 91% of those samples were fentanyl. So occasionally we're seeing other major components or perhaps plaster, as Georgia pointed out. Very importantly here, we're seeing a much higher proportion of xylazine than we saw in pills. It's 2.5% versus 10%. It's still a small proportion, but pretty consistently, we're more likely to be seeing xylazine in powder form. I was talking with a clinician yesterday who works in an opioid treatment program. They're seeing the same thing. They're primarily seeing xylazine in powder, but generally not in pills as of now. So that's something that we're seeing. And then just to mention here a little bit more on the powder front, we occasionally see fentanyl by itself, but this is where you're also able to see what are these combinations. 10% of the time there's methamphetamine present. Again, about 9% of the time xylazine is present. That gives you a little more sense there. And then lastly, to show you the benzodiazepines. The benzodiazepines are usually non-pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. They are almost always presented and look like a pharmaceutical benzodiazepine, but they almost never are. So that's important to understand. So we do see occasionally pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. We rarely see fentanyl in those types of products. So that's just like the world's fastest overview of the webpage. I just wanted you to sort of see what exists, hopefully get you curious. You're going to need a big thermos of coffee to sit down and digest all of that, but I encourage you to take a look. And please know that's just one presentation of the data. It's our first presentation of the data. You saw examples of what's being put up on dry erase boards at the site. It's a very different presentation of the data for different audiences, but we wanted to give you a little sense of what this looks like. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Caleb. So I'm just going to share our resource screen here. So people have access to the links. And again, these slides and presentation will be available. So folks have access to that. And then I will pull up this Q&A. There's a few questions in here. We'll address the ones that we can and share them. All right, so this first question, what are the biggest caveats you give to people about all 3 test strips? And what utility do fentanyl test strips have with the current prevalence of fentanyl in the drug supply? Georgia, Maria.
So I definitely talk about this a lot with clients. So I describe it. We've got 3 different technologies we're going to test with today. We have our FTIR machine. Biggest limitation with that is limit of detection around 5%. So trace amounts of things, really small components, I won't be able to see with that machine, which is why we complement it with test strips at point of care. So like, for example, blues, I often can't see fentanyl on my machine, but they do contain fentanyl. And when I use fentanyl test strip, they're positive for fentanyl. But the FTIR can find what a component is, what the substance is. So this is methamphetamine, rather than just saying this is the presence or absence of it. And it can also tell me information about cuts or buffs. So like inactive things cannot be shown on the FTIR. And then to combat the lack of trace amounts of things, we send it off for secondary testing where it is GCMS testing. And so they are able to find trace components of things, but the caveat with that is they are not allowed to give any information about non-active things. So I'll find mannitol on my machine, but the lab will not say anything about mannitol. And they can't give any kind of precise numbers about percentages, which I would say is the most common thing people want to know, but we can't give any information about. We can give some relative information with the FTIR, comparing, it to the regular supply or comparing it to another sample that they have, or comparing the main component and the cut in there. But we can't give precise information, and neither can the lab we send them off to. And what utility do fentanyl test strips have? I would say they are very helpful and they're a good tool. I would say drug checking beyond that needs to be a lot more accessible, because something I've learned with fentanyl test strips is they can be very inaccurate or difficult to read if you're not doing steps. Even if you do steps exactly as you should, you sometimes might just get the wrong answer, or it'll be reactive when it shouldn't be reactive. We do hundreds of test strips all the time, and it can be, you're just staring with a flashlight looking for that second line and you start to make it up in your head. So they're useful. But I would say I do believe that maybe false positives within fentanyl test strips have kind of contributed to this narrative of there's fentanyl in everything, when that might not be the most accurate if we did other testing methods. For example, it wasn't until I started doing drug checking that I learned that fentanyl test strips were not tested with tar heroin, and there are a bunch of false positives with tar heroin. And I've been saying for years, like, check your tar with fentanyl test strips. And now I know that might be giving people some answers that are not completely accurate. So they are helpful, but I would definitely say further testing should be accessible for people. It's just a screening tool.
Do you have anything you'd like to add, Malia?
Just really to underscore, it is just a screening tool. It is a really useful screening tool in some circumstances, but I'm constantly, like, as I'm giving out test strips in the SSP, I'm always spending a little extra time talking about the procedure, because it's really easy to do them incorrectly and end up with a result that doesn't reflect the reality of what's in the sample in front of that person. And that contributes to fear and decisions made on a basis of not reality. So I don't love that. We spent a lot of time talking about them, we spent a lot of time encouraging folks. If you find something that has fentanyl in it that shouldn't have fentanyl in it per the test strip, please bring it in so that we can check it out. It's okay to drop it in the Dropbox so you can anonymously engage in the process without feeling uncomfortable, but we really want to know about that because I want to help you feel more empowered and safer around what you're seeing. And I want to have an accurate sense of what is available locally currently.
And I would say the same thing goes for xylazine test strips of any kind.
Definitely.
The next question, do you find the local community to be aware and supportive of your work, or what pushback have your centers received, if they've received any?
I think it's a mixed bag, right? This has been something that we've discussed in different spheres. Again, primarily we're promoting this program to folks who are actively engaged in syringe service program already, and so are potentially going to be a little bit more open to the idea, right? I have generally positive feedback from the participants I'm serving. I have generally positive feedback from SSP participants who are like, that's not for me, but it's really cool that you're doing it. But we also aren't spending a bunch of time papering the whole city with like, hey, come bring your drugs in, right? There's a balance to be struck in maintaining this service as available to the folks who are actually going to use it and need it, and making sure the rest of our community feels safe and comfortable with the way that we conduct our business here.
I'm definitely lucky to be situated in Seattle, and within the name of public health, it gives me a lot of privilege to be able to do this service. I don't have to be as fearful as other people do of police presence. We do have a large number of people who like to be secret shoppers, or come in and take photographs when people are not aware of it. And so, you know, this call has been the most public I've ever been about the fact that we do drug checking down there. We definitely keep it on the down low for the safety of our participants, people who want to come there. We hate bringing film crews down there, so please don't come. So I expect as it gets more public, there will be a number of people that don't agree with what we do, but it is lawful to be doing it. There are protections, and hopefully those people can start to understand the benefits of it. But it's, you know, a matter of the number of people in Seattle. Someone's going to disagree with it and be upset. But we'll keep our participants safe, and I will keep doing it.
Let's see. There's a question about the governor's press conference yesterday. Did either of you happen to see that? I did not. So.
I didn't see that. My only comment would be, I hope that money goes to places where it'll be used to fund harm reduction and drug user health. I certainly hope that does not go towards the police combating the fentanyl crisis. I would also say I don't consider it a fentanyl crisis. I would say it's an overdose crisis. It's not just about fentanyl. People are overdosing on methamphetamine combined with fentanyl, methamphetamine alone, cocaine, all sorts of things. It's overdoses, I think, that is the real problem.
I'll just mention, since I was there, that it was pretty broad around strategic directions as legislative and budget agenda, focusing across harm reduction, health engagement hubs, prevention, recovery supports, expanding access to opioid treatment programs and methadone. So it was pretty broad.
That looks like the other couple of questions had typed answers. Thank you, Susan. So I think that's it for today. That's our webinar. I really, again, I appreciate Georgia and Malia being here. I also want to acknowledge like the other people within this network who couldn't be here, and hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. So they are involved as well. Also super lovely people. This whole network is, like I said, just incredible, and it's such a cool thing to be a part of. And so thank you both for being here and providing your expertise and your experience.
Thank you for having us.
Any departing knowledge or anything that you would like to give?
If you want to get your drugs checked, let me or Malia know. We'll
Come
hook
hang
you
out.
up.
Yeah.
If you
And
wanna
approach
go
the
to
drug supply with
services-
curiosity.
Mhm.
That's the big piece. Like, this is all about curiosity and learning and empowerment.
For sure. Awesome. Cool. Well, I am going to end the webinar then. Again, thank you everyone for being here. We will make sure that you get the link for the recorded webinar and the slides as soon as they are put up. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.